The Sahara. The name alone conjures images of an endless, sun-blasted wasteland, windswept dunes, mirages, and silence broken only by the shifting of sand. It stretches more than 9 million square kilometers across North Africa, making it the largest hot desert in the world. For most, it is a place devoid of history, a void where nothing could have ever flourished. But what if this understanding is wrong? What if, buried beneath the dunes and heat waves, there once existed a vast and thriving civilization, one that rivaled the might of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley? What if ancient cities, roads, and waterways once crisscrossed the land where now only sand remains? And most importantly, what if evidence of this civilization has not merely been lost, but erased? This is not the tale of fantasy or fringe theory. It is a story told through the forgotten words of ancient cartographers, glimpsed in the symbols etched on neglected maps, whispered in the manuscripts of traveling scholars, and recently illuminated by the cold eye of orbital satellites. The Sahara was not always a desert. This much is fact. Millennia ago, it was a lush, green savanna teeming with life, lakes, forests, wild animals, and perhaps people, complex, organized, and advanced. Today we will begin a journey, not just across the desert's scorching plains, but across centuries of hidden history, of forbidden knowledge, erased maps, vanished libraries, and buried cities. We will decode the work of Herodotus, Ptolemy, Al-Idrisi, and Leo Africanus. We will question why so many references to Central Sahara civilizations disappeared around the time European colonial powers began redrawing borders and writing their own histories. In this desert, time is not measured in hours, but in layers. Each dune is a page of an ancient book, each rock a forgotten sentence. The sands of the Sahara are not lifeless, they are the keepers of something much older, and perhaps much more unsettling than we ever imagined. This is the story of the secret empire beneath the Sahara, and the maps that were erased. In the age before satellites and global positioning systems, the world was a puzzle of rumors and observations stitched together by hand. The map-makers of antiquity were more than just artisans. They were historians, explorers, and at times, dangerous truth-tellers. Take Claudius Ptolemy, the 2nd century Greco-Roman polymath, whose Geographia compiled the known world with remarkable precision for its time. Or Herodotus, whose descriptions of the people and places beyond the Nile included tales of vast rivers and trading cities in the heart of Africa. Places that modern textbooks dismiss as exaggerations or myths, and yet their maps and writings contain geographic clues pointing to rivers where none exist today, lakes in the middle of modern desert, and mentions of peoples with complex social systems. Why do these ancient texts describe a Sahara so radically different from today's lifeless desert? Did these authors merely fabricate, or were they recording truths that modern eyes have failed to verify? Medieval Islamic cartographers like Al-Idrisi continued this tradition. Working in 12th century Sicily, Al-Idrisi compiled a world map and geographic encyclopedia that dwarfed anything Europe would produce for centuries. His maps showed not just the coastal outlines of Africa, but detailed the interior, rivers, cities, roads. One of these rivers, flowing west from the mountains of the Central Sahara to the Atlantic, has no modern equivalent. Yet geological surveys and satellite imaging have recently revealed the ghost of such a waterway, a dry bed of what might once have been a mighty river. Why would Al-Idrisi invent such a thing? These ancient maps point toward a historical truth we've long ignored. The Sahara was mapped because it was inhabited, not sparsely, not by scattered nomads, but by organized societies capable of trade, agriculture, and construction. Ptolemy's references to cities now lost and Al-Idrisi's rivers that vanished under sand suggest a forgotten era, one where the heart of Africa was not a void, but a vibrant core. Some modern scholars quietly speculate that political pressures and colonial biases have led to the systematic omission of these early African civilizations. After all, history is often written by those who wish to claim discovery, not by those whose ancestors already lived in the places being discovered. We begin then not with a myth, but with a mystery. The mapmakers did not lie. But someone, later, may have decided their truths were too inconvenient to preserve. For centuries, travelers and geographers alike have looked across the Sahara and seen only desolation. But in recent decades, satellite imagery and advanced geological surveys have begun to tell a different story, one hidden beneath the sand. Using radar sensors and infrared imaging, researchers have discovered the footprints of ancient rivers, dry, winding courses etched invisibly into the land. These are not the works of imagination. They are real riverbeds, fossilized paths of flowing water that once fed lakes, wetlands, and perhaps entire civilizations. Some of these riverbeds span hundreds of kilometers, crisscrossing the Sahara like veins beneath the skin. One of the most striking discoveries is the so-called Tamanrasset Paleo-River. Buried beneath sand and rock, this massive river system once flowed from the Hogar Mountains in Algeria westward toward the Atlantic Ocean. At its height, it may have rivaled the Nile in volume. The Tamanrasset is not visible to the naked eye. Only satellite radar capable of penetrating meters of sand can reveal its course. Yet some ancient maps, like those of Al-Idrisi and early Arabic explorers, show rivers exactly where this hidden system lies. Coincidence? Further evidence comes from the mega lake Chad. Today's Lake Chad is a fraction of its former size, a shallow, shrinking body of water plagued by drought and overuse. But in prehistoric times, this lake was a vast inland sea, over 350,000 square kilometers at its peak, dwarfing all modern African lakes except Victoria. Shorelines of this ancient lake still mark the landscape, curving like scars through Niger and Chad. In some places, archaeological digs have uncovered fishhooks, canoes, and even buried settlements along these ancient shores. The implications are immense. If the Sahara once held such vast water systems, then it also had the means to support life, not just nomadic herders, but farmers, city dwellers, artisans, and rulers. And where there is water and settlement, there is culture, trade, and memory. But that memory seems to have been severed. Why did this thriving ecosystem vanish? Climate change, certainly. Around 5,000 years ago, the African humid period began to end. Rainfall patterns shifted, monsoons receded, and the once green Sahara began to dry. The process was not instant. It took centuries, but with each passing generation, the rivers shrank, the lakes disappeared, and the people either moved or perished. What makes this even more intriguing is how little these facts feature in mainstream historical narratives. The focus remains fixed on the Nile and the Mediterranean, with the Sahara cast as a natural barrier, an empty sea of sand. But the evidence suggests that for a time the Sahara was not a barrier at all, it was a bridge, a fertile corridor connecting cultures across the continent. So why is this story missing from our textbooks? Why do we not teach of the cities that may have lined the banks of the Tamanrasset or of the great lakeside civilizations of prehistoric Chad? Perhaps because much of the physical evidence remains buried, but perhaps also because history, as we know it, is selective. In this chapter of our journey, the rivers do not flow and the lakes are dry, but their memory remains, sketched in sand, hinted at in ancient drawings, and revealed, piece by piece, by machines orbiting high above. These ghost rivers are not fiction, they are evidence, and they ask us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about Africa's past, because under the desert, the Sahara still remembers. Beneath the unyielding glare of the Saharan sun, scattered across remote plateaus and hidden among shifting dunes, lie the crumbled remains of something extraordinary, stone structures weathered but unmistakably shaped by human hands. They are not mere piles of rock. They are remnants of architecture, walls, enclosures, foundations, silent witnesses to a time when wind was not the only thing that moved across these plains. One of the most mysterious of these places is Tassili N'Ajjer, located in southeastern Algeria. Today it is part of a protected national park, but in ancient times it may have been one of the most vibrant cultural centers in North Africa. The area is famous for its rock art, over 15,000 engravings and paintings spread across sandstone outcrops. These images, some dating back 10,000 years, depict animals long extinct in the region: giraffes, elephants, hippos. But more importantly, they show people hunting, dancing, farming, and even herding cattle. Among these paintings are scenes of what appear to be structures, circular huts, enclosures, and ceremonial spaces. The level of detail suggests an organized society, not just nomadic tribes, but people who lived, worked, and celebrated in one place. Archaeologists have also uncovered pottery shards, tools, and signs of long-term settlement in nearby rock shelters. And yet, despite its significance, Tassili N'Ajjer remains largely excluded from most mainstream discussions of early human civilization. Why? Because it doesn't fit the narrative. Civilizations, we are told, emerged along great rivers: the Nile, the Tigris, the Indus. The idea of a civilization thriving deep within the Sahara doesn't align with that tidy timeline, and so it is brushed aside as prehistory, a term that strips these people of identity, agency, and complexity. But Tassili is not alone. Across Niger, Mali, Libya, and Mauritania, satellite imagery and expeditions have revealed dozens of similar sites: stone circles, buried foundations, and ancient wells. In the Adrar Desifogas mountains of Mali, explorers have found what may be remnants of early towns, networks of stone enclosures that seem too strategic to be random. In Wadi al-Ajal of Libya, burial sites with intricate tombs suggest a hierarchical society with spiritual practices and social structure. One of the most stunning revelations came from the Air Mountains, where dry stone walls stretch for kilometers, hinting at either fortified cities or extensive agricultural terracing. And in Mauritania's Risha structure, a massive geological formation nicknamed the Eye of the Sahara, some speculate the pattern may have been chosen by early people for symbolic reasons or even as a central settlement location. Though the scientific consensus still regards it as a natural feature, the possibility of its ritual or territorial significance cannot be dismissed entirely. Why would so many structures so spread out exist in what we now call a wasteland? Because it wasn't always one, and because people adapted to their environment with intelligence and resilience. The same wind that now scours these stones once cooled the walls of homes, temples, and markets. What these ruins whisper is not mythology but forgotten fact. These were cities of stone built by hands we no longer name, cultures whose stories have been reduced to broken pottery and overlooked carvings. Yet they tell of community, of vision, and of the will to build permanence in a land that would one day try to erase it all. These are the stone cities of the wind, and they are still waiting to be remembered. When we picture the Sahara, we often imagine it as a wall, an unbreakable barrier of sand and heat that separated civilizations of the Mediterranean from the sub-Saharan kingdoms of Africa. But for thousands of years, the Sahara was not a wall, it was a highway. Centuries before camel caravans carved iconic routes across its dunes, the Green Sahara hosted thriving trade networks. These networks, often overlooked in mainstream history, connected far-flung regions of Africa and beyond. They did not rely on ships or wagons, but on knowledge of terrain, stars, water sources, and on the ingenuity of people who saw the desert not as a wasteland, but as a bridge. Archaeological discoveries in regions like Garamantian territory in today's southwestern Libya have revealed highly organized societies centered around oasis cities like Jerma. The Garamantes were not primitive desert dwellers. They developed complex irrigation systems known as fogaras, underground tunnels that carried water from aquifers to surface gardens, allowing agriculture to flourish in seemingly impossible conditions. These systems mirrored those found in Persia, indicating long-distance technological exchange. The Garamantes were also avid traders. Roman historians describe them as merchants who dealt in gold, salt, slaves, ivory, and exotic goods from what we now call sub-Saharan Africa. In turn, they supplied North Africa, and through it Europe, with precious resources. Carved rock art in the Fezzan region depicts chariots, cattle, and domesticated animals, suggesting not just mobility, but wealth and social hierarchy. Their trade routes extended south into the Sahel and even deeper into West Africa, linking with proto-cities that would one day become parts of legendary empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. The salt-gold slave trade that made Timbuktu rich was not new in the 14th century. It evolved from pathways that had existed for millennia. One of the most intriguing clues comes from ancient depictions of copper and tin, essential components of bronze. Northern Africa lacked these metals in abundance, yet Bronze Age tools have been found across the Mediterranean world, tools that chemical analysis links to West African mines. Could it be that Saharan trade was an invisible artery in the Bronze Age economy? The desert also carried ideas. Linguistic studies show surprising links between Berber dialects and languages further south. Artifacts and pottery styles suggest aesthetic and cultural blending across vast distances. And then there are the stories, oral traditions passed down through generations, speaking of journeys across green plains, of rivers where now there is only dust, of alliances between distant peoples. These highways did not always have names. They were marked not by stone milestones but by memory, sacred rocks, waterholes, star patterns. And as the climate dried and the green Sahara faded, so too did many of these routes. But some endured, caravans adapted, routes shifted, and cities like Timbuktu, Walata, and Agadez rose to prominence on their foundations. Modern archaeologists and satellite researchers are now finding the faint imprints of these pathways. Long, faint tracks barely visible from space hint at ancient trails walked for centuries. They do not follow random lines. They link settlements, oases, and rivers that once flowed. Why are these networks not more widely known? Perhaps because they disrupt the prevailing notion that Africa was isolated, a continent awaiting discovery. These highways prove otherwise. They show a continent connected internally and externally with its own economic engines and centers of innovation. The Sahara's forgotten trade highways were not just routes of commerce, they were routes of connection, lifelines across a fertile land now lost to time. And though buried under sand and silence, they are not gone. Like the civilizations they served, they wait to be remembered. When we think of ancient Egypt, our minds turn instinctively to the Nile. We imagine towering pyramids, solemn temples, and a society fixed along a single river. But few pause to ask, what lay beyond the western horizon? What did the pharaohs see when they looked toward the desert? The answer is more complex than mere emptiness. Though modern history isolates Egypt as a Nile-centric civilization, evidence suggests that its people and its rulers had knowledge of and connections with the lands beyond the river, deep into what is now the Sahara. Ancient Egyptian texts and wall reliefs contain tantalizing clues. The most famous among them is the tale of Yam, a mysterious land located to the south and west of Egypt. Pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, particularly during the reign of Pepi II, circa 2200 BCE, sent expeditions to Yam in search of exotic goods, incense, ebony, ivory, and even dancing pygmies. But where was Yam? Traditional interpretations place Yam somewhere near modern-day Sudan. However, alternative readings and geographic clues hint that it could have been further west, possibly located in regions of southern Libya or northern Chad. Areas now swallowed by desert, but once connected by river systems and savannas. Another example comes from the Libu and Meshwesh tribes, ancient peoples of what is now Western Egypt and Libya. These groups, often referred to as Libyans in Egyptian texts, were not just nomads. They had social organization, rulers, and even military alliances. During the late New Kingdom, the Meshwesh became powerful enough to challenge Egyptian authority, eventually merging with it. Pharaohs from the 22nd dynasty, like Shoshenq I, were of Libyan descent. Egypt was not isolated, it was entangled. Trade artifacts also suggest cross-desert interaction. In the tombs of the New Kingdom, scarabs and beads made of Nishapur lapis lazuli and Saharan red ochre have been discovered. Materials not native to Egypt. How did they get there? Through a web of exchanges that almost certainly included the Western oases and possibly connected to Saharan trade routes. The Dakhla and Karga oases in Egypt's western desert provide more direct evidence. These lush pockets of green, now isolated in arid terrain, were once thriving centers of agriculture and trade. Archaeological digs in Dakhla have revealed not just Roman and Islamic-era ruins, but also earlier pharaonic settlements, complete with administrative buildings, granaries, and temples. The very existence of these communities implies a consistent Egyptian presence deep into the Sahara. Even mythology offers hints. The Egyptian underworld, Duat, was often associated with a western journey, and the land of the dead lay where the sun set. In religious texts, this wasn't just symbolic, it reflected a real geographic orientation. The West was not unknown, so it was sacred, mysterious, and powerful. One remarkable example comes from the Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondences from the reign of Akhenaten. Among the many regional discussions is a mention of emissaries arriving from the West, bearing gifts and requesting alliances. These weren't kingdoms on the Mediterranean, they were inland powers, perhaps long forgotten, perhaps erased. What if the lands to Egypt's west weren't just desert, but neighbors? Civilizations with whom Egypt traded, fought, and merged. What if those civilizations were later lost, not because they were insignificant, but because they were inconvenient to the narratives written by later empires? When the pharaohs looked west, they did not see a void, they saw opportunity, lands of wealth, mystery, and culture. Today, buried beneath layers of time and sand, those connections remain, awaiting rediscovery. The Nile may have been Egypt's lifeline, but the Sahara was its frontier, and perhaps once its partner. Once, thousands of years ago, the Sahara was alive. Its now blinding dunes were covered in grasslands, lakes shimmered beneath the sky, and wildlife roamed freely through what we would now call barren wasteland. But something changed. Slowly, relentlessly, the lush Sahara withered. The rivers dried, the forests died, the people moved or vanished. The desert, as we know it today, was born not in a single catastrophic moment, but over centuries of transformation. This chapter tells the story of that disappearance, not as a tale of apocalypse, but as a slow-motion unraveling of a once flourishing world. The period now known as the African Humid Period, AHP, began roughly 14,800 years ago and peaked between 9,000 and 6,000 years ago. During this time, monsoon rains shifted northward due to changes in Earth's orbit, bringing water and fertility deep into the continent. Paleoclimatic data from lake sediments, pollen records, and even ancient fish bones confirmed that the Sahara was once a mosaic of grasslands, lakes, rivers, and even forests. But around 5,500 years ago, something began to change. The rains weakened, the green began to recede. A transition that had once taken centuries now began to accelerate. Between 4,500 and 3,000 BCE, the Sahara shifted dramatically from verdant savanna to the arid desert we know today. The consequences were immense and human. Populations that once thrived along lakes and rivers began to migrate. Many moved toward the Nile Valley, helping to swell the early populations of what would become ancient Egypt. Others pushed southward, contributing to the foundations of West African civilizations. But not all could move. Some groups vanished from the record altogether. The rock art of Tassili N'Ajjer, once full of wildlife and rain dances, suddenly ends, replaced by abstract, fragmented figures. This wasn't just a natural phenomenon, it was also a cultural rupture. Entire traditions, mythologies, and ways of life were tied to the landscape, to rain, to lakes, to animals no longer present. The desert didn't just bury cities, it buried identities. Interestingly, the transition is recorded in oral traditions across Africa. Tales of times when the rains were regular, or of ancestors who sailed great waters in the north, persist even today. These are not idle legends. They may be the final echoes of the Green Sahara, passed from voice to voice as memory faded into myth. Geological studies of dried lake beds, such as the massive Paleolake that once occupied the Lake Chad Basin, reveal shoreline settlements, tools, and even harpoons. Some lake beds, like Lake Megachad, suggest a body of water over 300,000 square kilometers in area. When it vanished, it took with it fisheries, trade hubs, and agricultural zones. Climate change on this scale would normally enter global history books, but the story of the Sahara's desiccation is still marginal. Partly this is due to the remote nature of the evidence, but partly it reflects a deeper reluctance to acknowledge the complexity of pre-colonial African history. The Sahara did not become a desert in a vacuum. The process was intertwined with human adaptation, ingenuity, and loss. People didn't simply fade, they tried to adapt. They dug wells, redirected herds, migrated along ancient trails. Some innovations survived, others were erased by the creeping sands. Today, as we face our own era of climate uncertainty, the Green Sahara stands as both a warning and a wonder. It reminds us that climate is not fixed, that landscapes shift, and that civilizations rise and fall with them, but it also urges us to reconsider what lies beneath our assumptions and beneath the sands. The desert that now seems eternal was once a living world. Its disappearance was not an ending but a transformation, one still waiting to be fully understood. When we think of libraries in the ancient world, our minds turn to Alexandria or perhaps Baghdad. But far south of the Mediterranean coast, beyond the familiar timelines of Western history, stood other repositories of knowledge, quieter, more fragile, and now nearly forgotten. Among these, the libraries of the Sahara once shone with brilliance. Their manuscripts whispered of astronomy, medicine, poetry, trade, and law. And then, one by one, they disappeared. No city symbolizes this intellectual legacy more than Timbuktu. Nestled at the southern edge of the Sahara in modern-day Mali, Timbuktu rose to prominence in the 14th and 15th centuries as a center of learning, trade, and Islamic scholarship. By the 1500s, it reportedly housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Its scholars wrote in Arabic, but also in African languages rendered in Arabic script. Their works covered theology, mathematics, botany, philosophy, and even political science. Many of these texts were not imports. They were local productions, the product of African pens and minds. They cited earlier sources, including records from the medieval Sahel, oral traditions and knowledge passed down through pre-Islamic generations. The libraries of Timbuktu were not just religious archives, they were repositories of African memory, but Timbuktu was only the tip of a vast iceberg. Across the Sahara, in cities such as Chinguetti, Walata, Tadmeka, and Agadez, smaller but equally vital collections once thrived. Families guarded books as treasures, copying them meticulously by hand. In some regions, entire lineages of scribes carried the responsibility of preserving and transmitting knowledge. Some of these texts describe trade routes now lost to time. Others mentioned cities that no longer appear on maps and then came decline. From the 17th century onward, a combination of political upheaval, colonial incursion, and economic reorientation toward the Atlantic gradually sapped these cities of influence. When European colonizers arrived, they often dismissed African writing as derivative or non-existent. Some libraries were looted, others were burned. Most were simply forgotten, buried in the sands of irrelevance. In the 20th century, Western archaeologists discovered many of these manuscripts in decaying private collections. Yet even today, the majority remain uncatalogued, stored in metal boxes, wooden crates, or mud brick libraries without climate control. They are disintegrating, page by page. The Ahmed Baba Institute, created in Mali to preserve these works, has managed to digitize a portion, but political instability, terrorism, and neglect continue to threaten their survival. And the true tragedy? These texts could change our understanding of African history. They provide direct testimony that Africa had its own systems of law, governance, science, and cultural philosophy long before European contact. They speak of civilizations not only adapted to the desert but flourishing in it. They offer place names that don't appear on any modern charts, echoes of cities swallowed by time. They describe trade in goods we no longer associate with the Sahara: books, textiles, dyes, instruments. They also reveal something more profound, that history is often hidden not by accident but by intent. Colonial narratives rarely had room for literate, intellectually rich African societies. To admit that Timbuktu once rivaled Renaissance Europe in its manuscript culture would demand a rewriting of global history. And so silence was easier, but silence is never permanent. As scholars, activists, and archivists race against time to preserve the last of these works, a new vision of the Sahara emerges, not as an intellectual void, but as a library itself, a vast, sandy archive filled with the fragments of what once was. The vanished libraries of the desert are not entirely gone, they are waiting. Beneath layers of dust and denial, they still hold their secrets. And one by one, those secrets are beginning to surface. Maps are more than charts of geography. They are statements of power, perspective, and purpose. Throughout history, those who drew maps decided what mattered and what did not, what was known, what was ignored, what was claimed, and sometimes what was erased. In the case of the Sahara, ancient and medieval cartographers once filled the blank spaces with remarkable detail, but over time those details vanished, replaced by emptiness. This chapter is about the mapmakers who drew too much and why their work disappeared. We begin with Claudius Ptolemy, the Greco-Roman scholar whose Geographia laid the foundation for Western cartography. Working in the 2nd century CE, Ptolemy compiled not only coordinates and place names but also references to inland rivers and settlements south of the Mediterranean. He described regions that match parts of the present-day Sahel and even suggested the existence of a massive inland lake far inland, possibly a memory of what we now call Mega Chad. Centuries later, Arab and Berber geographers added even more. In the 10th and 11th centuries, scholars like al-Bakri, Ibn Hawqal, and al-Idrisi mapped a Sahara that was vibrant, connected and populated. Al-Idrisi's 12th century Tabula Rogeriana was a masterpiece, a world map drawn for the Norman king Roger II of Sicily. In it, the interior of Africa was anything but blank. Cities like Tadmeka, Gao and Zafun appeared with roads, rivers and trade routes linking them. Some even had visual symbols, domes, markets, fortifications. Why did later European maps erase all of this? The age of exploration that began in the 15th century did not expand maps, it redrew them. Portuguese, Spanish, and later British and French mapmakers produced new globes with vast blank spaces over Africa's interior. They claimed these areas as unknown despite existing records to the contrary. The new cartography served empire, not truth. Empty spaces justified conquest. If the land was uninhabited or unclaimed, it could be taken. If cities had no name, they didn't count. By the 18th and 19th centuries, colonial maps had largely erased earlier knowledge. Older sources were dismissed as mythical or unscientific. The Sahara was drawn as a vast yellow void, dotted occasionally with camels or oases, but devoid of culture, cities, or history. Even Timbuktu, once renowned in Europe as a city of gold and books, was often left off maps or relegated to legend. But recent scholarship is challenging this erasure. Digitized versions of old Arabic manuscripts show consistent place names across centuries. Comparative analysis with satellite data reveals riverbeds and geological formations where these early maps claimed water once flowed. In short, many of the myths match the terrain. One startling example comes from a 14th century Catalan atlas, which includes a rich visual of West Africa featuring Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, holding a golden scepter and orb. His placement was not random. It indicated control over a vast network of cities and trade. And yet, within a few generations, these places vanished from maps entirely. Why would map makers discard information they already had? Because maps are never neutral. They serve agendas, they tell stories sanctioned by power. When Europe began carving up Africa, it was easier to present the interior as a wilderness awaiting civilization. A populated, literate and connected Sahara disrupted that narrative. Today, as historians revisit these ancient maps, a new vision of the Sahara is emerging. Not as a void, but as a continent within a continent. Its cities may be buried, its rivers dry, but its memory still pulses through ink lines and faded parchment. The cartographers who drew too much were not wrong, they were erased. But now we can begin to redraw what was taken. In the vast emptiness of the Western Sahara, deep in the desert plains of Mauritania, lies one of the strangest natural formations on Earth, a circular structure so large it can only be fully seen from space. Known as the Risha structure, or more poetically, the Eye of the Sahara, it is a geological enigma. A massive bullseye carved into stone, 40 kilometers wide, it has captivated scientists, mystics, and historians alike. From above, the eye resembles a series of concentric rings, like ripples in the earth. Mainstream geology describes it as a deeply eroded dome of sedimentary rock, formed over hundreds of millions of years by wind and water. It is not a crater nor the result of an impact. It is, according to current science, a quirk of erosion and uplift, a coincidence of natural processes. But coincidences in places like the Sahara often hide older truths. In recent decades, the Risha structure has sparked theories far beyond geology. Among the most provocative is the suggestion that it may be the remnant, or at least the inspiration, for a lost city. Some have even linked it to Atlantis based on Plato's descriptions of a city surrounded by concentric circles of land and water. According to this interpretation, Plato's Atlantis was not a mythic island, but a memory of an inland civilization that existed before the Sahara turned to desert. This theory, while controversial, is not born of fantasy alone. Ancient maps and oral traditions of West Africa speak of great, circular cities or central gathering places. Berber and Fulani stories tell of a time when the Earth's eye watched the stars, hinting at a sacred or cosmological importance tied to a central formation. More pragmatically, the Risha structure sits at a strategic point near ancient trade routes. If not a city, could it have served as a landmark? Its visibility from afar would have made it a perfect orientation point for desert travelers. Some scholars suggest it may have been a ceremonial site or natural gathering place, a kind of ancient waypoint where caravans met, water was found, or stories exchanged. While no confirmed archaeological ruins have been discovered within the eye itself, limited surveys have revealed stone tools and scattered artifacts around its perimeter. These may belong to transient populations, but the possibility of deeper layers buried beneath the dust remains. The area has never been excavated on a major scale. What also raises eyebrows is the relative silence surrounding the Richae structure in academic literature until the advent of satellite imagery in the 1960s. Despite its size and visibility, it was barely mentioned in Western accounts. Why was it overlooked? Some believe it was simply too remote. Others wonder if the cultural memory of the structure was intentionally left out of colonial mapping, deemed irrelevant or worse, inconvenient. Even without Atlantis, the eye remains important. It reminds us that the Sahara is not uniformly featureless. Beneath its monotony are marvels, geologic, human, and symbolic. The Richa structure is not merely a circle in stone. It is a focal point of forgotten significance, a place where the land seems to whisper, "Something happened here." Whether it was a city, a shrine, or a beacon, we may never know for sure. But its very presence forces us to ask better questions. Who saw it before we did? Who named it first? And what did it mean to them? Coincidence? Or memory? The eye of the Sahara waits, watching as it always has. History is not merely what happened. It is what was written, preserved, and passed down, and just as often, what was not. In Western archives, museums, and libraries, the story of the Sahara is striking in its absence, not because there was no story to tell, but because that story did not serve the empires that came to dominate it. When European explorers began their incursions into the African interior during the 18th and 19th centuries, they encountered complex societies, thriving trade routes, and cities older than many in Europe. Yet in the accounts that filtered back to London, Paris, or Berlin, these realities were often downplayed, distorted, or erased. The Sahara was rendered a void, a canvas onto which colonial ambition could be projected. Travelers like René Caillié, the first European to reach Timbuktu and return alive, described the city in 1828 as disappointing, a place of mud brick homes and faded glory. What he failed to recognize or chose not to emphasize was that the city had already been in decline for centuries, following invasions, shifts in trade routes, and ecological pressures. The legacy of Timbuktu as a center of learning, scholarship, and wealth was barely mentioned in his reports, as though it had never existed. This silence extended into institutional record-keeping. European archives categorized African history not by civilizations or cultural achievements, but by colonial boundaries and resource value. Maps were drawn with blank interiors. Manuscripts in Arabic or Ajami, African languages in Arabic script, were filed without translation, dismissed as religious texts or unimportant folklore. Entire collections of documents, seized, purchased, or copied, were locked in vaults, rarely studied. Some scholars have even suggested that manuscripts recovered during colonial expeditions were never catalogued at all, languishing in museum basements as curiosities rather than sources. In French and British institutions, the term sub-Saharan Africa became a euphemism, not for geography, but for the perceived cultural void below the Mediterranean coast. This wasn't passive neglect, it was curated ignorance. By portraying the Sahara as a cultural desert as well as a physical one, colonial powers justified their presence as bringers of civilization. To acknowledge that complex societies once flourished in the interior, literate, scientific, urban, would challenge the very foundation of their imperial logic. So instead, the archives remained silent. Even today, the legacy of this silence lingers. In Western education systems, African history is often taught in fragments. Egypt in isolation, the transatlantic slave trade as a brutal anomaly, modern conflicts without context. The connective tissue, the Saharan corridor that linked civilizations from the Nile to the Niger, is missing. But things are beginning to change. A new generation of historians, many from Africa and the diaspora, are demanding access to these hidden archives. They are translating manuscripts, reinterpreting maps, and challenging the old narratives. They are finding that the Sahara was not a void, but a crossroads of ideas, peoples, and memory. And they are discovering that what was once buried in silence may yet speak again. To reclaim the true history of the Sahara, we must first confront the silence in the West, the empty folders, the mislabeled documents, the museums full of unexamined truths, for only by listening to what was left out can we begin to hear what was always there. Empires crumble, cities vanish, rivers dry, but people endure. In the aftermath of the Sahara's transformation from savanna to desert, and through centuries of conquest, silence, and colonial erasure, some voices survived, not in parchment or stone, but in memory. The nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples who traversed the desert carried more than goods across the sands. They carried stories. The Tuareg, often called the Blue People for the indigo dye in their clothing, are perhaps the most iconic of these desert custodians. With a written script of their own, Tifina, and a rich oral tradition, the Tuareg have preserved fragments of the Sahara's forgotten civilizations. Their poetry speaks of stone cities, of lost lakes, of ancestors who once farmed the highlands. They remember places that modern maps no longer name, places buried by time and shifting dunes. Other groups like the Sanhaja, Fulani, and Zagawa maintain similar cultural memories. In their songs and folktales echo references to green valleys, vast herds, and ancient trade gatherings where gold, salt, and knowledge were exchanged in equal measure. Linguists and ethnographers have begun to trace these oral histories, finding that some names and motifs align with archaeological sites yet to be fully understood. These communities were not passive victims of environmental or imperial change. They adapted, shifted routes, learned the stars, and created complex systems of survival that bridged the ancient and the modern. Some even served as reluctant guides to European explorers, silently watching as old sacred places were renamed or dismissed. To these peoples, the desert is not empty. It is alive with memory. Each dune is a landmark, each rock a marker. Their ancestors' graves are unmarked but not forgotten. Their migrations echo patterns established millennia ago when the Sahara was still green. In oral traditions, the word remember carries more weight than history. It is a living act, not a static record. Griots, poets, and elders transmit not just events, but meaning. When a Tuareg elder speaks of a lost well where 3 rivers met, It may not appear on a modern map, but satellite imagery sometimes finds dry deltas eerily close to those descriptions. Modern science is finally beginning to listen. Genetic studies reveal deep continuity among desert populations, connecting them to early pastoralist cultures that flourished during the African humid period. In some tribes, burial practices, jewelry styles, and symbolic carvings match artifacts uncovered far from their current territories, evidence of a mobile inheritance carried across centuries. Yet despite this richness, these voices have often been ignored or treated as quaint relics of a fading world. Anthropologists once collected desert folk tales like exotic curiosities, stripping them of context. But these aren't myths, they are archives, just not in the format Western scholars were trained to recognize. In preserving oral memory, the people of the Sahara preserved fragments of a truth that others tried to erase. They are not remnants, they are witnesses, carriers of continuity across ages of rupture. The desert may have buried stones, books, and cities, but it could not bury those who remembered. Their footsteps, worn deep into caravan paths, still trace the roots of forgotten empires. And if we choose to listen, truly listen, they might just lead us home. Long before GPS, compasses, or even the consistent use of maps, the people of the Sahara looked up. The stars were not just decorations in the night sky, they were guides, calendars, and even deities. In a landscape where shifting sands erased trails and landmarks vanished with the wind, the heavens offered permanence, and ancient Saharan societies knew them intimately. Across North Africa, petroglyphs and alignments carved into stone speak of a profound astronomical awareness. In the Tassili Naja plateau, alongside rock art of giraffes and herders, some images appear to map constellations. In Nabta Playa, near the southern Egyptian border with Sudan, lies one of the most astonishing and least discussed prehistoric astronomical sites on Earth. Dating to at least 6000 BCE, Nabta Playa was a ceremonial center constructed by a pastoralist society that flourished during the African humid period. It features a series of stone circles and alignments that mark the summer solstice, as well as the rising of key stars in Orion's belt. This places it among the oldest known astronomical monuments in human history, predating Stonehenge by over 1,000 years. The builders of Nabta Playa were not primitive. They understood celestial cycles, built structures to track them, and embedded this knowledge into ritual life. Archaeological evidence suggests the site served as both an observatory and a pilgrimage center, attracting communities from surrounding regions. Why then is it so little known? Because Nabta Playa and other sites like it challenge assumptions. They suggest that the Sahara, long portrayed as a backwater, was in fact a cradle of observation and intellectual complexity. They also point to cultural continuity with later civilizations. The solstice alignments at Nabta echo rituals later seen in dynastic Egypt. Some researchers believe these early skywatchers may have influenced the cosmology that shaped the pyramids themselves. Astronomical knowledge in the desert was not abstract, it was deeply practical. The Tuareg, like many nomadic peoples, used the stars for precise navigation, naming individual stars and constellations in ways that mapped onto travel routes and seasonal cycles. Their sky was not the Greco-Roman zodiac, it was their own, a lived local map of movement and meaning. In Berber traditions, constellations were given names like the Camel's Neck or the Herdsman's Fire. Specific stars signaled planting seasons, migration periods, and spiritual observances. These star maps were passed orally, encoded in song and proverb, forming a knowledge system that modern astronomers are only beginning to decode. And yet, with colonization came dismissal. European observers catalogued indigenous sky lore as folklore, not science. astronomical structures were either ignored or misattributed. Sites like Nabta Playa languished in obscurity for decades, mentioned in niche journals but excluded from World Heritage narratives. That is now beginning to change. With advances in archaeoastronomy and satellite surveying, researchers are re-evaluating ancient alignments throughout the Sahara. In Mali, stone enclosures once thought to be livestock pens are being reconsidered as possible observatories. In Mauritania, burial mounds align with solstice points. And in Libya's Fezzan region, cairns and rock carvings show consistent directional orientation toward celestial events. What emerges is a pattern. Across time and place, the people of the Sahara encoded the sky into the earth. They created observatories not of glass and steel, but of stone and sand. They didn't just chart the stars, they wove them into culture, agriculture, and belief. In many ways, their understanding of the heavens was more holistic than ours. The stars were not distant. They were part of life's rhythm. And in remembering them, we remember that intelligence and insight are not the exclusive property of modernity. The ancients of the Sahara read the stars with precision and reverence. Their skies were not empty. Like their lands, they were full of meaning. The Sahara is not just a sea of sand, it is a graveyard of cities. Beneath its dunes lie the silent remains of once thriving settlements, marketplaces, temples, and homes. These places were not figments of legend. They existed. People lived there, built there, worshipped, traded, and dreamed. And then the sands came. The desert does not erase all at once. It creeps. A few centimeters a year, a sandstorm here, a shift in a watercourse there. Over decades, centuries, entire towns are swallowed, erased from the surface but preserved beneath it. And in rare moments, the desert reveals its secrets. In northern Mali, near the ancient caravan town of Essouk, archaeologists have uncovered layers of structures buried beneath centuries of drifted sand. These are not crude shelters. They are complex stone constructions, with evidence of courtyards, hearths, and ceremonial spaces. Ceramic shards found at the site reveal trade links as far as North Africa and even the Mediterranean, hinting at a once bustling crossroads. Further west in Mauritania, excavations near Kumbi Saleh, often identified as the capital of the Ghana Empire, have uncovered remains of what may have been a large administrative city. Though much of the stone has been removed or repurposed by locals over the centuries, foundations still indicate organized street layouts and zoning. Radiocarbon dating places its prime between the 9th and 11th centuries CE, aligning with Arabic records that described a city of stone in the middle of the desert. In Algeria's Tadrat Carcass and Libya's Messac Setafet, archaeologists have found entire rock-cut dwellings and granaries, now almost invisible beneath sandbanks. These sites suggest not just nomadic stops but permanent habitation, with access to water sources that have since dried up. Some dwellings include engravings on their walls, not just of animals, but of domestic scenes, tools, and symbols yet to be fully decoded. In the Air Mountains of Niger, satellite imagery has identified rectangular outlines and geometric patterns buried in otherwise featureless terrain, likely the remains of storage facilities, dwellings, or marketplaces. These patterns do not occur naturally. They are the fingerprints of a human presence lost to time. The problem is not a lack of sites, it is access and attention. Political instability, harsh environments, and lack of funding have limited comprehensive archaeological work in the Sahara. Most of what we know comes from surface-level surveys or chance discoveries. Beneath every dune may lie a chapter of human history, waiting for the right storm, the right satellite pass, or the right question. And even when discoveries are made, they are often minimized. Colonial-era archaeology focused on monuments that aligned with European narratives, pyramids, temples, and burial sites resembling the familiar. The mud brick towns and market hubs of the Sahara, though once central to trans-Saharan trade, were dismissed as minor or peripheral. But make no mistake, these cities were real. They moved goods, gold, salt, and people across thousands of kilometers. They connected West Africa to the Islamic world, to Europe, to the East. They left behind bones, tools, blue-glazed beads from the Mediterranean, and cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean. And now they leave us with questions. How many cities lie beneath the dunes, unmarked and unmourned? What knowledge, what innovations, what languages were lost with them? What would our understanding of history look like if we counted these places not as footnotes, but as foundations? The sands of the Sahara are deceptive, they appear barren. But beneath them is a buried archive, one that, if we choose to unearth it, could rewrite the map of the ancient world. These are the sands that swallowed the cities, but not their memory. Not yet. Even when stone crumbles and maps fade, language can survive. It clings to the tongue, passes between generations, and hides clues in plain sight, in names, in idioms, in turns of phrase whose original meanings have long been lost. In the Sahara, language is a living fossil. It carries within it echoes of ancient migrations, forgotten cities, and cultural crossroads now buried beneath sand. Throughout the Saharan and Sahelian regions, linguists have identified curious anomalies, words, structures, and place names that don't fit neatly into known language families. Some villages bear names that seem older than the languages spoken there. Others preserve terms for rivers, lakes, or forests, even when no such features exist nearby today. These linguistic fossils may be the last remaining artifacts of civilizations erased by climate, war, or empire. One of the most revealing examples is the survival of substrate languages, remnants of older, now extinct tongues that persist in the vocabulary or grammar of dominant modern languages. For instance, certain Berber dialects contain root words that appear unrelated to Afro-Asiatic origins. These may reflect a linguistic layer from pre-Berber inhabitants of the Sahara. Similarly, in regions of Niger and Mali, some Songhay languages contain structural patterns that suggest influence from now lost tongues. They preserve terms for long-gone crops, vanished trading practices, and even social roles that have no modern equivalent, as though the vocabulary remembers what the world has forgotten. Toponyms, place names, are particularly potent. Across Mauritania, Mali, and southern Algeria, hundreds of settlements and geological features carry names that translate awkwardly in local dialects but hint at prior meanings. A dried-up wadi may be called the mouth of the river, while a mountain range bears a name meaning where the herds turn. These names imply a time when the land looked very different, when rivers flowed, forests grew, and herds indeed turned through now barren passes. Even words for measurement, time, and direction preserve memory. In Tuareg and Berber traditions, stars are not just navigation points, they are temporal markers. Some terms describe the angle of moonlight, the timing of a journey, or the shape of a shadow at noon. Knowledge systems passed orally, with vocabulary rooted in environmental conditions that no longer exist. In this way, language becomes both archive and map. Scholars have also found that oral poetry in these regions often employs formulaic phrases that seem archaic, vestiges of older linguistic structures. These include fixed metaphors for authority, ancestry, or natural phenomena. In some cases, these formulas survive even when the full meaning is no longer understood by the speaker. They are repeated because they are sacred, or beautiful, or the way it has always been said. But they also hold historical value, offering clues to the symbolic worldviews of forgotten peoples, and language can travel further than any caravan. The spread of Islam brought Arabic across the Sahara, influencing local tongues and providing a shared script. Yet even within Arabicized regions, indigenous terms persisted. In Timbuktu, medieval manuscripts were often written in Arabic, but peppered with local expressions. A 15th-century text on trade includes a word for caravan rest stop not found in classical Arabic, but common among Songhai speakers. In some ways, colonialism posed an even greater threat to these echoes. European languages, French, English, Spanish, attempted to overwrite local toponyms and suppress native tongues. Maps were redrawn, names standardized, and multilingualism discouraged. But despite this, the desert resisted. Local names remained in oral use, even if they never appeared in official gazettes. Today, linguists, anthropologists, and historians are working together to record and preserve these verbal traces. Field recordings, lexicons, and digital archives are beginning to catalogue endangered dialects and unexplained anomalies. Each preserved word is a data point, a strand in the web of Saharan memory. The languages of the Sahara do not whisper. They endure. They mark the landscapes of absence with presence, carving memory into sound. To listen closely to a name, to ask why a word exists where it does, is to hear the heartbeat of a civilization thought lost. These are not just words, they are echoes in the language, and they are still speaking. In the grand narratives of empire, it is often the flow of gold that defines the rise and fall of kingdoms. But in the Sahara, another substance was equally prized, salt, and with it came more than trade. It brought ideas, stories, belief systems, and the stitching together of cultures across thousands of kilometers. The desert's economy was more than material, it was spiritual, intellectual, and deeply human. The trans-Saharan trade networks that flourished from the 8th to the 16th century CE were some of the most complex and expansive in the pre-modern world. Caravans of camels, sometimes numbering in the thousands, moved slowly but surely across unforgiving terrain. What they carried was not just merchandise, but meaning. From the north came textiles, glassware, manuscripts, and horses. From the south came gold, cola nuts, ivory, and enslaved people. But perhaps the most consistent and life-sustaining cargo was salt, quarried from vast deposits in Tagaza, Taudeni, and other desert mines. Carved into slabs, loaded onto camelback, and traded ounce for ounce against gold, salt was not merely seasoning, it was survival. It preserved food, sustained bodies, and powered economies. But alongside these trade goods came something else: language, law, and belief. As Arab and Berber merchants made their way southward, they carried Islam with them, not at sword point, but through transaction and teaching. Mosques rose beside markets, manuscripts followed merchants, scribes recorded contracts, not just for goods, but for marriages, debts, and theological disputes. The great cities of the Sahel, Timbuktu, Gao, Walata, Jenne, grew not just from their geographic locations, but from their role as cultural brokers. In these cities, scholars debated astronomy and jurisprudence in Arabic beside locals who spoke Songhai or Tamashek. A Tuareg caravan leader might study hadith one day and haggle for camels the next. Commerce and scholarship were entwined. This unique blend of trade and thought produced a society in which wealth was measured not just in gold, but in books. Timbuktu, by the 15th century, housed tens of thousands of manuscripts. Many families measured prestige by how many volumes they owned, not how much land. Libraries were passed down like treasure, and books were copied by hand in delicate script, their margins filled with commentary and reflection. The very rhythms of caravan life reflected spiritual discipline. Journeys were timed to the lunar calendar. Prayers marked the hours. Traders often traveled with scholars who doubled as imams. It was not unusual for a single caravan to carry both salt and scripture. sustenance for the body and the soul. Even the contracts used in trade reveal the blending of material and spiritual life. Many agreements began with invocations of God, included clauses for fair treatment, and referenced Quranic principles of justice. Trade routes themselves became paths of pilgrimage not only to Mecca, but to knowledge, connection, and faith. Yet this integrated world was fragile. The fall of empires, the rise of European coastal trade, and the eventual colonial carving of Africa's interior severed these ancient arteries. Railroads replaced camel trails, languages of commerce shifted from Arabic to French or English, books were looted, libraries abandoned, and knowledge fragmented. But the memory remains. In parts of Mali and Niger, markets are still arranged according to ancient traditions, with the salt vendors in the north stalls and the goldsmiths facing the sun. In Tuareg songs, the rhythm of the caravan is echoed in poetry that recalls both physical travel and spiritual longing, salt and gold, word and soul. These were the twin currencies of the desert, and in remembering how they once flowed together, we remember that the Sahara was not just a barrier, it was a bridge where wealth, wisdom, and worship moved as one. The Sahara is vast and ancient, but it is not chaotic. Hidden beneath its wind-sculpted dunes and rocky plateaus lies an invisible geometry, deliberate, precise, and hauntingly symmetrical. For centuries, these shapes went unnoticed, obscured by sandstorms and distance. But today, with the aid of satellite imagery, a startling truth is emerging. Someone, or many someones, once etched purpose into this landscape. From above, certain sections of the desert appear stitched with lines, grids, and circular formations. These are not the result of random geological processes. In regions of Algeria, Libya, and Niger, archaeologists and remote sensing researchers have catalogued hundreds of geoglyphs, large-scale land patterns made by removing stones or aligning earthworks into geometric forms. Some take the shape of circles with radial spokes, others resemble long, straight alignments that stretch for kilometers. Their purpose is unknown. Some scholars suggest they were funerary markers linked to ancient burial practices. Others propose that they were astronomical tools, aligning with the solstices, equinoxes, or prominent stars. In the region of Messac Setefet, Libya, clusters of small stone mounds form repeating shapes that appear mathematically organized, suggesting advanced spatial reasoning and long-term planning. One of the most curious discoveries is a network of stone rectangles and squares in southern Algeria and northern Mali. Some are as large as football fields, most are perfectly aligned to cardinal directions. Their scale and uniformity challenge the assumption that early Saharan societies were strictly nomadic. These structures imply not only settlement, but shared systems of measurement and design. Even older are the megalithic alignments found near the borders of Mauritania and Senegal. Lines of standing stones stretch across flat plains, forming what appears to be ritual avenues or celestial sightlines. The similarities to Stonehenge or Karnak in Europe are striking, and yet these African counterparts receive a fraction of the recognition. There are also more enigmatic patterns. In parts of Niger's Air region, satellite analysis has revealed faint, almost imperceptible concentric circles etched into dry soil, far from any known archaeological site. These rings do not match natural erosion. They may have been agricultural systems, symbolic centers, or even boundaries for vanished cities. Without ground excavation, their meaning remains elusive. Why are these patterns so little studied? Partly because of their scale. Many are only visible from great height. Partly because of political and logistical challenges that prevent detailed fieldwork. but also because for a long time scholars assumed that the desert's history began and ended with nomads. The idea of ancient Saharan peoples manipulating geometry on a vast scale did not fit the narrative, and yet they clearly did. Whether carving land for the dead, charting stars, managing water, or marking sacred space, these patterns reveal a civilization, or civilizations, that thought in grids, circles, and alignments. A culture that saw not emptiness, but structure. Not wilderness, but a canvas. There are whispers among local communities too. Some Tuareg elders speak of the ground's compass, a phrase that suggests knowledge of orientation systems long lost to formal history. In certain oral traditions, specific routes are described not only by their landmarks but by angles. Turn east a hand's breadth at the fourth hill, ride 3 star lengths south. Language that hints at internalized geometry. Modern researchers are only beginning to model these sites using digital elevation and AI pattern detection. Early results suggest we've barely scratched the surface. Like Nazca in Peru or the desert kites of Arabia, the Sahara may yet prove to be one of the richest unexplored repositories of ancient geometric expression on Earth. It challenges our assumptions. The desert is not just a graveyard of lost cities. It may also be a gallery, one built in stone, sand, and silence, by hands that knew symmetry and minds that saw meaning in line and form. The hidden geometry of the Sahara is not silent. It waits, in the angles of forgotten lines, for us to learn how to see again. No civilization thrives forever. Even the most resilient cultures must contend with the one force no empire can ignore: the climate. In the Sahara, the very land that once gave life to cities, farms, and trade, slowly, and then suddenly, became hostile. Winds shifted, rain stopped, lakes vanished. What was once a green, vibrant world turned dry and unyielding. The desert turned against them. This transformation was not instantaneous. It occurred in phases over thousands of years, punctuated by moments of rapid collapse. The most significant of these was the end of the African humid period, a time between roughly 14,800 and 5,500 years ago, when monsoons drenched the Sahara, feeding lakes, rivers, and fertile grasslands. When this period ended, it was not a gentle retreat. It was a sudden silence. Sediment cores from former lakes like Lake Megachad reveal a sharp transition around 5,000 years ago. Within a few centuries, water levels dropped drastically. Archaeological sites that once sat on lake shores were suddenly surrounded by dry earth. In the Ténéré Desert of Niger, entire Neolithic communities vanished from the record, their tools and bones left behind as the environment became unlivable. The process was uneven. Some areas clung to life longer, especially where underground aquifers allowed for oases, but even these refugees could not hold forever. As rainfall patterns shifted southward and the Intertropical Convergence Zone, ITCZ, migrated, the Green Sahara rapidly disappeared. Vegetation gave way to dust, herds dwindled, wells dried. This climatic upheaval had cascading effects. It forced migrations on a massive scale. Pastoralists who had grazed cattle in what is now desert moved toward the Nile Valley, likely contributing to the rise of early Egyptian civilization. Others moved south, blending with Proto-Sahelian societies and influencing the cultures that would later produce empires like Ghana and Mali. But not all moved. Some stayed and died. Others tried to adapt, building more permanent settlements near shrinking water sources, digging deeper wells, or experimenting with drought-resistant crops. Evidence from sites in Mali and Mauritania suggests that communities constructed stone-lined cisterns, irrigation channels, and even rain harvesting systems. Still, technology could not overcome drought forever. There is growing evidence that climatic shocks were not confined to to deep prehistory. In the 9th and 14th centuries CE, pulses of megadrought struck West Africa, severely weakening trans-Saharan trade. Arabic chronicles describe caravans lost to thirst, cities abandoned, and famines that lasted for years. One Moroccan traveller in the 14th century noted that entire stretches of the desert had become uncrossable. These collapses were not just ecological, they were social. When water failed, alliances broke, trade faltered, spiritual doubt crept in. Oral traditions from the Tuareg and Hausa speak of the time when the sky forgot, a poetic rendering of prolonged drought. These tales describe not just hardship, but confusion, a loss of trust in nature itself. Even in the legendary city of Timbuktu, climate played a role in its slow decline. As the Niger River shifted its course and trade routes changed, the city's access to goods and water diminished. Coupled with invasions and colonization, ecological change sealed its fate. What was once a metropolis of books and gold became a shadow of its former self. And yet the memory endures. In some desert regions, older generations still speak of the green years, tales passed down from elders who themselves inherited them, of times when the land was kinder, when the wind smelled of grass, and the wells overflowed. Whether these memories reflect myth or historical truth, they testify to a deep sense of environmental loss. Today the Sahara continues to expand. Climate change is once again altering rainfall patterns, with the Sahel caught in a precarious balance between desert and savanna. In many ways, the ancient lesson repeats: civilizations are not destroyed by swords alone. They can be unraveled by the slow, patient work of the sky. When the desert turned against them, the people of the Sahara did not vanish in a single moment. They adapted, resisted, and moved, but in the end, the land itself decided, and it does not forget. For centuries, the Sahara kept its secrets. Cities vanished beneath dunes, rivers dried without a trace, and languages faded from memory. But now a new kind of explorer walks the edges of this ancient ocean of sand, not with camels or compasses, but with satellites, sensors, and algorithms. And slowly the desert is beginning to speak again. It turns out that forgetting is not the same as erasure. The Sahara has not lost its past, it has buried it. And with the right tools, that past can be found. In the last 2 decades, scientists and archaeologists have turned to remote sensing technology to peer beneath the dunes. Using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and LiDAR, light detection and ranging, they have uncovered what the human eye could never see from the ground: fossilized riverbeds, long-buried walls, ancient roads, and even lost settlements. One of the most significant breakthroughs came from analyzing radar data from the Space Shuttle Endeavour mission in 2000. The radar, capable of penetrating dry sand, revealed a massive, long-dormant river system, the Tamanrasset Paleoriver, that once flowed from the central Sahara westward to the Atlantic Ocean. Its path runs beneath hundreds of kilometers of present-day desert, supporting legends of forgotten rivers found in ancient texts and maps. In Mauritania, satellite scans revealed a network of possible urban foundations beneath the sands near the eye of the Sahara. Though no formal excavations have yet confirmed these structures, the patterns, rectangular layouts, linear alignments, suggest human design, not nature. In southern Libya, researchers using LiDAR have mapped what appears to be a vast agricultural system, now defunct, with traces of irrigation ditches, boundary walls, and even roadways. These remnants, invisible from the ground, tell the story of a planned landscape. It suggests that the desert, at its peak, was not just inhabited, it was engineered. Even smaller clues matter. In northern Mali, magnetic imaging has detected faint traces of metalworking activity in areas previously thought uninhabited. Ground samples revealed residues of smelting and tool production, changing assumptions about where and how technology flourished in ancient Saharan societies. Artificial intelligence is now accelerating this rediscovery. Researchers feed satellite data into neural networks trained to recognize patterns consistent with human settlement. These models can detect the telltale geometry of walls, streets, and agricultural fields faster than any human analyst. In some cases, they've identified dozens of likely archaeological sites in areas that have never been surveyed. But technology does more than reveal. It also confirms, validating oral histories and ancient maps that Western scholarship once dismissed. Where Tuareg elders spoke of a stone field beyond the Red Dune, LiDAR sometimes finds rectangular ruins. Where Arabic chronicles described rivers hidden by time, satellite imaging uncovers their dry, winding courses. This convergence between ancient knowledge and modern science is perhaps the greatest revelation of all. The desert remembers, not in myths or metaphors, but in measurable, mappable ways. The shapes of the past still lie beneath our feet. They simply require the right questions and the right instruments to be heard. Yet these discoveries face challenges. Political instability, funding shortages, and the vastness of the Sahara make full-scale excavation difficult. Many sites identified from space remain unvisited, their secrets still buried. And climate change, ironically, threatens these fragile records. As desertification accelerates, so does the risk of wind erosion and loss. Still, hope remains. In recent years, partnerships between African universities, international research centers, and local communities have grown stronger. Projects in Mali, Niger, and Algeria are combining high-tech analysis with oral interviews, linguistic surveys, and traditional knowledge. The goal is not just to discover, but to restore. To let the people of the desert reclaim the stories written in their land. The Sahara is not done teaching us. Its sands may shift, but its memory endures, in stone, in silence, and now in pixels. The desert remembers. And we are finally learning how to listen. History is not just what survives, it is also what is allowed to survive. And in the case of the Sahara, much of its legacy was not simply lost to time, it was erased by empire. When European powers began their colonization of Africa in the 19th century, they came not only with weapons and railroads, but with a worldview. In that worldview, Africa was a land of voids, without history, without writing, without civilization. To justify conquest, the colonizers needed the land to appear empty, and its people to appear primitive. The deep past of the Sahara, with its cities, scholars, astronomers, and engineers, did not fit this story, so it was ignored, or worse, actively buried. In colonial archives, cartographers redrew Africa's interior as blank spaces, libraries filled with Arabic and Ajami manuscripts, written by Africans for Africans, were dismissed as religious texts of no intellectual value. Many were seized and never returned. Others were stored improperly and left to decay. In some cases, colonial officers used ancient manuscripts to wrap shipments or fuel campfires. The knowledge systems of the Sahara, built over centuries of trade, travel, and scholarship, were rendered illegitimate. French and British ethnographers often recorded oral histories only to label them as myths, regardless of their historical accuracy. Colonial curricula taught African children that their ancestors were uncivilized before European contact. The deeper past was not discussed, it was made to disappear. Entire cities suffered the same fate. Timbuktu, once a beacon of scholarship known across the Islamic world, was portrayed by European writers as a crumbling village, not a center of learning, but a curiosity. European visitors dismissed reports of its libraries and schools, preferring tales of golden fantasies or mud-walled backwardness. Even when presented with written evidence, thousands of surviving manuscripts, many scholars refused to believe that black Africans had produced such a corpus. Colonial museums in Europe collected Saharan artifacts but failed to study them in context. A necklace from a burial site in Niger might end up in a drawer in Paris, separated from its story, mislabeled, and forgotten. Rock art was photographed but not translated. Ancient settlements were bulldozed for roads or railways. And this was not accidental, it was ideological. Colonial powers had a vested interest in presenting themselves as the authors of African history. If African civilizations had risen and fallen before, independently, intelligently, and with complexity, then the rationale for colonization crumbled. It was easier to pretend that the Sahara had always been empty, that Africans were waiting to be civilized. This narrative did not disappear with independence. Even today, global education systems often present African history as a series of isolated episodes, Egypt in the north, Mali in the west, the Zulu in the south, with little emphasis on their interconnection or the vast network of Saharan exchange. The idea of a literate, urban, scientific Sahara remains fringe. But that is beginning to change. African scholars, archivists and activists are reclaiming the past. Projects in Mali, Niger, Algeria and beyond are digitizing manuscripts, restoring libraries, and reinterpreting oral traditions. University departments across the continent are training a new generation of researchers to tell their own stories on their own terms, and they are not alone. Satellite archaeology, linguistics and climatology are providing new tools to corroborate what was once dismissed. The past is being pieced back together, not from the imperial centers of Europe, but from the sands where it was born. To erase a civilization is not as easy as it seems. The land remembers, the people remember. And history, even when silenced, waits. The Sahara was never empty. It was made to look that way. Now, the veil is lifting. Maps are not passive documents, they are arguments. When cartographers ink rivers, name mountains, or draw borders, they make choices. Choices that shape how we see the world. For centuries, the maps of Africa, especially of the Sahara, told a carefully edited story, one of emptiness, silence, and mystery. But today, those maps are being redrawn, not just with ink, but with knowledge, memory, and rediscovered truth. The classical Western map showed the Sahara as a blank expanse. In the margins, artists placed camels, date palms, or cryptic illustrations of mythical creatures. City names disappeared. Rivers once noted by ancient geographers like Herodotus or Al-Idrisi were erased. In the place of knowledge, the unknown was painted in gold. Well, this was no accident. It reflected the colonial logic that sought to frame Africa as a continent of voids, waiting for roads, flags, and railways. But beneath those illusions lay centuries of human movement, architecture, scholarship, and agriculture. Today, layer by layer, the false geography is being peeled away. The new map of the Sahara is not just physical, it is historical. It is being drawn through collaboration between archaeologists, linguists, oral historians, and local communities. It includes ancient caravan routes that ran from Gao to Tripoli, trans-Saharan salt roads that linked to Gaza to Timbuktu, and vanished cities whose outlines are visible only by satellite. It also includes cultural borders, zones where languages shift, where architectural styles blend, where belief systems converge. In regions like Agadez or Chinguetti, architectural remains are now being recontextualized not as isolated phenomena, but as pieces of a larger civilizational web that spanned the entire desert. With each discovery, each lost manuscript restored, each buried wall uncovered, the old map becomes less credible. The Sahara is no longer a barrier, it is revealed as a corridor, a living highway through which goods, people, and ideas flowed for millennia. This transformation in understanding demands more than academic adjustment. It calls for a rewriting of global history. The Sahara's story intersects with the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and sub-Saharan Africa. It connects Mali to Morocco, Egypt to Ghana, Mecca to Marrakesh. To map the Sahara anew is to map a world that was always connected, but deliberately shown as divided. New atlases and educational materials are slowly beginning to reflect this. Schools in Mali and Niger now include curricula focused on trans-Saharan history. Museum exhibits in Europe are being challenged to return stolen artifacts or reinterpret them with local context. Universities are launching interdisciplinary programs that bridge desert archaeology with climate science and anthropology. Digital platforms play a crucial role. Interactive maps created by African-led research institutions overlay ancient trade routes with modern satellite imagery. Oral traditions are geotagged and linked to physical landmarks. Users can walk from oasis to oasis as a medieval merchant once did, not through fantasy, but through verified history. Rewriting the map is also about reclaiming dignity. For generations, desert peoples were told they came from nowhere, that their ancestors wandered emptiness, contributing nothing. The new map says otherwise. It honors the complexity of Tuareg astronomy, the literacy of Songhai scribes, the architecture of Saharan towns built in adobe and stone. But this process is not simple. It faces resistance from institutions wedded to outdated narratives, from governments focused on other priorities, and from logistical challenges in researching a region that remains vast, underfunded, and politically unstable. Still, the work goes on, every stone uncovered, every star pattern decoded, every place name understood. They all redraw the lines. The Sahara is no longer just a place on a map. It is a story, one that stretches from past to present, from sand to sky, from silence to memory. To rewrite the map is not merely to correct mistakes, it is to ask new questions, open forgotten doors, and let a buried world rise again. The desert is not blank, we just stopped looking closely enough. Not all was lost to sand and silence. Scattered across the edge of the Sahara are buildings, humble, weather-worn, sometimes hidden in alleyways or buried in dust, that contain the fragile remains of a vast intellectual world. These are the libraries still standing, guardians of manuscripts that defied empire, erosion, and neglect. The most famous of these is in Timbuktu, Mali, where private family collections and public archives once held over 700,000 manuscripts. Written in Arabic and in African languages using Arabic script, Ajami, these texts span theology, astronomy, medicine, jurisprudence, poetry, and history. Some are richly decorated, while others are simple but no less significant, the everyday records of a literate society. But Timbuktu is not alone. In Chinguetti, Mauritania, often called the City of Libraries, several families have guarded manuscript collections for generations. These libraries are often rooms within centuries-old homes, their walls lined with wooden chests and leather-bound volumes. Some of the texts date to the 13th century. The caretakers, often elderly men with no formal training in conservation, consider themselves not owners but stewards of knowledge. In Walata and Tadmeka, other Saharan towns once vital to trans-Saharan trade, similar collections survive. In Agadez, Niger, oral tradition and manuscript heritage combine, with scholars known as marabouts maintaining both written and spoken chains of learning. These are not dead relics. In many places, the texts are still read, quoted in sermons, or used in local jurisprudence. The fragility of these libraries is profound. Many exist without climate control, stored in wooden boxes or wrapped in cloth. Insects, humidity, and heat threaten the ink. In conflict zones, such as during the 2012 insurgency in Mali, armed groups targeted cultural heritage. In response, a heroic effort led by local librarians and international supporters smuggled tens of thousands of manuscripts out of Timbuktu to safer regions like Bamako, hiding the volumes in rice sacks and under floorboards. Today, preservation is a race against time. Institutions like the Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu and the Savama DCI project have digitized tens of thousands of pages. Scholars in Bamako work to restore pages using traditional methods alongside modern archival techniques. But the resources are limited and much remains at risk. Equally important is the task of interpretation. For too long, these texts were treated as exotic artifacts rather than living documents. Western scholars often catalogued them but failed to engage with their content. Now, African researchers are leading the charge, translating, contextualizing, and publishing the works on their own terms. These efforts are about more than preservation. They are acts of reclamation. They affirm that the Sahara was not intellectually isolated, but deeply connected to global debates. Timbuktu's scholars wrote treatises on law that were read in Cairo. Chinguetti's theologians corresponded with scholars in Morocco. Knowledge flowed north and south, east and west, and it still can. Digital access is changing everything. Projects like the Timbuktu Manuscripts Project and the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library's digital repository allow users from around the world to view high-resolution scans of these ancient pages. Some of the libraries now have solar panels and laptops, bridging medieval scholarship with 21st century tools. Yet the heart of these efforts remains local. In Chinguetti, families still gather during religious festivals to read aloud from texts written by their ancestors. In Timbuktu, children are once again learning the calligraphy of manuscript copying. And in the quiet courtyards of Agadez, elders continue to recite texts by memory, line for line. These are the libraries that still stand, not in marble halls, but in sand-colored homes, not behind glass, but in the hands of those who never stopped believing that knowledge was sacred. They remind us that history is not just uncovered. Sometimes it survives, waiting not to be found, but to be honored. The libraries are still standing, and so is the story they hold. Modern highways may crisscross the Sahara now, but beneath their straight asphalt lines lie the footprints of thousands of years of movement. These roads did not appear from nowhere. Many of them follow the logic, and in some cases the exact paths of ancient caravan routes. Though paved and widened, though now travelled by trucks instead of camels, they trace the same invisible geometry that once connected kingdoms, oases, and empires. The old caravan roads were not random. They followed water, topography, wind patterns, and seasonal rhythms. To survive the desert, traders relied on mental maps passed down through generations, star charts, dune silhouettes, rock landmarks. Today, those paths are memorialized not in stone, but in modern infrastructure. The Trans-Saharan Highway, for example, Route N1 from Algeria to Nigeria, echoes the historic trade axis that once linked the Maghreb with the Sahel. Along this modern road are towns that have existed for centuries, even millennia. Tamanrasset, Agadez, Zinda, all former caravan hubs whose layout still reflects the rhythms of camel traffic. In Mali, the road from Gao to Timbuktu traces a line once filled with traders bringing salt southward and gold north. Though today the route is partly paved and sometimes dangerous due to conflict, it remains a corridor of continuity. And even where roads no longer exist, satellite images reveal the scars of ancient trails, parallel lines worn deep into the earth, still visible from space. These paths shape not just commerce, but culture. Language clusters, architectural styles, and even musical traditions reflect centuries of movement along these arteries. Tuareg caravan songs contain stanzas that name specific wells and ridges still known by local elders. In some towns, market days remain synchronized across hundreds of kilometers, a lingering echo of trade rhythms. What's more, many modern national borders slice through these ancient routes arbitrarily. A single trading network that once unified Timbuktu and Gat now spans multiple countries, subject to checkpoints and paperwork. Yet people still move. Smugglers, migrants, and herders follow the same paths, not because they are convenient, but because they are remembered. This memory is both geographic and social. Many families in the Sahel still identify as descendants of traders, caravanners, or salt merchants. Oral genealogies recount how ancestors rode with the great herds or carried knowledge from the Nile to the Niger. These stories are not nostalgia, they are maps, living guides that inform movement, identity, and belonging. In some places, governments are rediscovering the value of these ancient networks. Projects in Niger and Chad aim to improve roads that follow historic routes, not merely for logistics, but as a way to reconnect regions fragmented by colonial borders. Tourism initiatives in Mauritania now include caravan trails, allowing visitors to walk or ride along restored segments of ancient paths. But not all routes are marked. Many exist only in memory, their physical traces obliterated by sand or development. In these cases, satellite archaeology becomes essential. Researchers have identified hundreds of ghost trails, faint depressions in the earth where thousands of hooves once passed. Some lead to known towns, others end in the desert, raising tantalizing questions about lost oases or forgotten outposts. What these routes reveal is the deep infrastructure of Africa, not of concrete and cables, but of continuity and knowledge. Long before the colonial state built its rails and roads, Saharan peoples had mapped the desert with their feet and minds. They knew where to go, when to go, and why it mattered. To drive across the Sahara today is to pass through layers of time. The gas stations and cell towers may be new, but the logic beneath them is ancient. Roads follow rivers that no longer flow. Towns stand where caravans once paused to rest. Beneath the asphalt lies memory, not fossilized, but beating. The caravan routes are not dead, they are embedded in the shape of cities, in the pauses between markets, in the rhythms of migration, and in the lines, still visible from space, where people walked, traded, prayed, and passed the desert from generation to generation. The maps may have changed, but the desert remembers the way. Before there were books, there were stones, and before there were letters, there were images, carved, painted, etched into rock with painstaking care. Across the Sahara, from Algeria's Tassili Naja to Niger's Aya Mountains and Libya's Tadrat Akakus, the landscape is scattered with one of humanity's oldest archives, rock art. These are the stones that speak, telling stories long before language had script. Some of these images are more than 10,000 years old, dating from a time when the Sahara was not a desert, but a savanna, teeming with life. Elephants, giraffes, antelope, crocodiles, cattle, and human figures fill the surfaces of cliffs, caves, and boulders. They are not merely decorative, they are records, visual testaments to changing ecosystems, social rituals, and spiritual beliefs. In the Tassili Naja Plateau in southern Algeria, thousands of engravings and paintings cover remote rock faces. Among them are scenes of hunting, dancing, farming, and herding, depictions of a vibrant life that once thrived under rainy skies. The most iconic are the so-called round head figures, humanoid forms with large, featureless heads and outstretched arms, often surrounded by dots or rays. Some scholars interpret them as shamans, spirits, or deities, suggesting early religious expression. In Libya's Tadra Takarkus, similar themes emerge. Rock shelters contain vivid polychrome paintings of cattle and herders, sometimes leading entire herds across wide open plains. The detail is astonishing. Some animals are adorned with horns, ropes, and decorative markings. These are not abstract works, they are deliberate documentation. The evolution of style is equally revealing. As the Sahara dried over millennia, the subjects of the rock art changed. The earliest images show wild game, elephants, lions, hippos. Later periods shift to domesticated animals, cattle, goats, camels, reflecting the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to pastoralism. Eventually, as water sources vanished and the desert expanded, the art dwindled, but it never disappeared. In Niger's Air Mountains, petroglyphs continue to be discovered in remote valleys. Some show geometric shapes, possibly calendrical or symbolic markings. Others depict warriors on horseback, armed with spears and shields, perhaps echoing later Saharan empires or reflecting cross-cultural influences from North Africa and the Sahel. For many years, this rock art was viewed by Western archaeologists as primitive or prehistoric. But modern scholarship, especially from African researchers, has repositioned it as part of an intellectual tradition. These images are not just art, they are archives, intentionally curated, situated, and preserved. They reflect not only what people saw, but what they believed, feared, and revered. Tuareg and Tubu oral traditions sometimes reference these stones. In local legend, some images are called the writings of the ancients or signs of the old sky. Certain rock shelters are considered sacred, with taboos around who may approach or touch them. These traditions, long dismissed by outsiders, may offer vital clues to interpretation. Technology is changing the study of rock art. High-resolution photography, 3D scanning, and digital enhancement now allow researchers to detect faded or superimposed layers. In some cases, entire scenes emerge, hidden beneath centuries of dust and sunlight. Remote sensing is also identifying new clusters of art in previously inaccessible regions. Yet much remains at risk. Looting, vandalism, weathering, and urban encroachment threaten these irreplaceable archives. In Libya, some sites were damaged during recent conflicts. In Algeria, tourism has sometimes outpaced preservation. International organizations have declared several major rock art regions UNESCO World Heritage Sites, but countless smaller sites remain undocumented. To preserve these stones that speak is to protect not just images, but memory. They remind us that long before pyramids, empires, or alphabets, the peoples of the Sahara were watching, imagining, and expressing. They recorded migration, ceremony, love, and death, not in books but in basalt and sandstone. When we look at these ancient figures, a woman dancing, a child leading cattle, a shaman reaching toward the stars, we are not gazing into obscurity. We are reading a kind of truth, a truth carved into silence, waiting to be heard. The desert does not forget. It draws its memory in stone. Water built the Sahara's first civilizations, and when it vanished, so did they. But unlike cities or scripts, water leaves behind hidden fingerprints, dried riverbeds, underground aquifers, mineral scars, and ancient shorelines traced in stone. To understand the lost world beneath the desert, we must follow these forgotten waters. Across the central and southern Sahara, vast geological formations reveal where rivers once flowed and lakes once shimmered. The most staggering example is Lake Megachad, which, at its height about 7,000 years ago, covered more than 350,000 square kilometers, larger than modern Germany. Its waters stretched across what is now Chad, Nigeria, Niger, and Cameroon. Today, Lake Chad is a shrunken remnant, less than 1/20th its former size. But from space, you can still see the outlines of its ancient banks. Satellite imaging and radar data have revealed a hidden network of paleochannels, fossilized riverbeds, that once fed this colossal lake. These include long-vanished tributaries that connected deep into the Sahara, linking it to Central Africa and, indirectly, to the Nile. This was not an isolated oasis, but a hydrological engine of a continent. In Algeria and Libya, radar scans have uncovered massive subterranean rivers, remnants of a time when rain carved canyons and fed wetlands. These rivers, like the Tamanrasset Paleoriver, once flowed westward toward the Atlantic Ocean. Though they now lie dry beneath dunes, they hint at a Sahara once crisscrossed by life-giving currents. Clues also lie in the rocks. In regions like Wadi al-Hayat and Fezzan, ancient lake beds hold sediment layers rich in freshwater diatoms and mollusk shells, unmistakable signs of past aquatic life. In some places, wave-cut terraces remain on cliffsides, etched there when water levels were dozens of meters higher. And then there are the wells, some of them astonishingly deep, that still tap into ancient groundwater. In Mali, Mauritania, and Niger, pastoral communities draw from fossil aquifers that have not been replenished for thousands of years. The water they drink today may have fallen as rain when the pyramids were young. Oral traditions preserve fragments of these aquatic pasts. Among the Kanembu of Chad, stories speak of the time of the Great Floodplain, when boats could travel for days without sighting land. In Tuareg songs there are verses that describe rivers that ran beneath the red sky and lakes where spirits once lived. These are not just myths. They are memories passed down from eras when water shaped not only the land, but the culture. The disappearance of water wasn't uniform. Some lakes shrank gradually. Others dried in catastrophic pulses. The African humid period, time when monsoon rains drenched the Sahara, ended around 5,500 years ago. But evidence shows there were intermittent rebounds, brief, wetter periods, when lakes returned and the land turned green again, only to recede once more. This instability forced adaptation. Populations shifted toward the Nile Valley, the Sahel, and the remaining oases. Trade routes changed. Livestock herding replaced fishing. Settlements followed the water as it retreated. And where they could, people dug in. Today, the legacy of lost water is still shaping the Sahara. As climate change accelerates desertification, scientists study ancient hydrology to understand resilience. Could forgotten aquifers be tapped to support new agriculture? Could fossil channels guide rainwater harvesting? There are risks, of course. Overuse of fossil water is unsustainable, but the past offers both warning and insight. Archaeologists continue to trace the edges of these old lakes using soil samples, pollen analysis, and remote sensing. Each find redraws the map of ancient habitation. Where there was water, there was life, and that life left tools, pottery, hearths, and burials, now buried in sand. The Sahara is not a uniform sea of dunes, it is a palimpsest, layers upon layers of memory, marked by water that came and went, carving valleys and shaping destinies. The desert is the result of that departure, but also the witness. The lost water is not entirely gone. It whispers through cracked basins, echoes in the shells of vanished lakes, and lingers in the taste of deep, cold wells. It reminds us that even the harshest lands once flowed with life, and that perhaps they could again. It is hard to imagine now a Sahara filled not with dunes, but with savannas, a land of lakes, rivers, forests, and rain. Yet for thousands of years, this was the reality. Between 10,000 and 5,500 years ago, the world's largest desert was a vibrant, living region, shaped not by drought but by water. This period, known as the African humid period, transformed the heart of northern Africa into an oasis of life. Rainfall was abundant. Monsoons pushed farther north than they do today, driven by subtle shifts in Earth's orbit and axis. What followed was a blossoming of ecosystems. Grasses spread across the landscape, trees clustered around lakes, and animals roamed in numbers that rivaled the Serengeti. We know this not just from sediment cores or pollen samples, but from what ancient people left behind. In the Tassili Naja, Aya Mountains, Gilf Kabir, and Enedi Plateau, rock art shows herds of elephants, giraffes, lions, antelope, and hippos. These images were not fanciful, if they were observations. Hunters, herders, and fishers recorded the world around them with vivid precision. The Sahara was not a barrier, it was a home. Around vast lakes, such as Megachad, Fezan, and Ahnet, communities flourished. Archaeological sites show settlements clustered around the shores with evidence of fishing, farming, and ceremonial life. At Gobero in Niger, a lakeside cemetery has revealed burials dating back 9,000 years, including individuals interred with grave goods, shell jewelry, and even flowers. One burial shows a woman and 2 children arranged in a tender, intimate posture. A family frozen in time beside a lake that no longer exists. These people were not wanderers, they were builders, herders, spiritual thinkers. Evidence of domesticated cattle, cultivated cereals, and pottery suggests they had not only adapted to the environment, they shaped it. The Green Sahara was not just fertile land, it was the foundation of civilization. But it did not last. Starting around 5,500 years ago, the African humid period began to wane. Rainfall declined, lakes shrank, grasslands retreated. Slowly, then rapidly, the green turned to gold, and the savanna gave way to desert. What caused this transformation is still debated, likely a mix of orbital cycles, feedback loops from vegetation loss, and changing sea surface temperatures. The effects were profound. People migrated, some east toward the Nile, where Egyptian civilization began to rise. Others moved south into what is now the Sahel, spreading knowledge of herding, metallurgy, and social organization. In this sense, the Sahara was not only a cradle of culture, but also a conduit that helped birth others. The collapse of the Green Sahara was not uniform. Some oases persisted. Rainfall returned in pulses, but the overall trend was toward aridity, and with it came new ways of life. Nomadism, trade, and seasonal migration replaced settled lakeshore communities. Yet the memory of that earlier world remained, in stories, in songs, and in the landscape itself. Today, remnants of this green era still surface. Subterranean pollen records, fossilized flora, shells in the middle of dunes, all whisper of a time when the desert breathed differently. Even the camel caravan routes of later centuries often follow the same paths once trodden by fishermen and herders. This transformation is not just a curiosity. It offers urgent lessons. The Green Sahara reminds us that climate is not static. Landscapes we see as timeless can change, dramatically, even catastrophically, within a few human generations. For a planet now facing rising temperatures, melting ice, and shifting rain belts, the Sahara's story is both warning and guide. It also invites humility. The ancestors who lived in the Green Sahara adapted to the Earth's rhythms, building, migrating, reinventing. They left behind more than artifacts. They left a model of resilience. When we look across the desert today, we are not staring into eternal silence. We are gazing across the memory of forests, wetlands, and villages. We are walking the floor of a vanished garden. The Sahara was green, and perhaps someday parts of it will be again. To cross the Sahara is to confront infinity. There are no roads in the shifting dunes, no permanent rivers, and few landmarks, and yet for millennia, humans crossed it, not blindly, but with purpose. Long before GPS or compasses, the peoples of the desert developed a system of navigation rooted in memory, stars and sand. It was a geography of the mind, passed down from elder to apprentice, clan to caravan. The Sahara's ancient navigators did not need maps, they carried their cartography in stories. Among the Tuareg, Zaghawa and Tubu, oral geographies described the desert in units of travel. 3 nights to the Red Hill, 2 moons to the Salt Spring. Place was marked by sensation, the taste of a well's water, the echo of wind off a specific cliff, the shape of stars when one camped near a certain dune. The stars were constant companions. Desert travelers learned to read the night sky as a living compass. The North Star, Tefest en Temdurt in Tamashek, was a reliable guide, but more intricate systems were used. Constellations were known by different names. Some mirrored animals, others spiritual figures. One Tuareg tradition divides the year by the appearance and position of specific star clusters, guiding not only direction, but seasonal timing for travel. During the day, orientation relied on the position of the sun, wind patterns, and the behavior of dunes. Not all dunes are alike. Some align with prevailing winds, others form crescent shapes or long ridges that run roughly east-west. An experienced traveler could read these shapes to estimate direction, a skill honed by repetition and inherited knowledge. Landmarks played a vital role, though they were not always large. A single tree, a unique rock, or a ruin might serve as a waypoint. In the central Sahara, ancient tumuli, burial mounds, dotted the landscape, serving not only as graves, but also as markers. Some caravan routes were memorized by listing such features in order, like verses in a poem. Water was another kind of compass. Wells, oases, and seasonal lakes dictated the logic of movement. Entire networks of trade, pilgrimage, and migration formed around these points. The knowledge of their locations, depths, and seasonal conditions was fiercely protected, sometimes considered the intellectual property of certain lineages. This desert wisdom extended to sound. Some nomads judged direction by the pitch of wind as it moved across specific types of sand or rock. Others claimed they could detect proximity to water by subtle changes in the scent of the air or the taste of morning dew. These skills may seem mythical, but they were grounded in empirical observation refined over centuries. Written records from Arab geographers, such as al-Bakri and Ibn Battuta, describe caravan guides who could lead journeys of thousands of kilometers with no instruments. These men were not merely navigators. They were repositories of collective knowledge, some trained from childhood, others recognized as masters after decades of practice. Among the Tuareg, such a guide is called an Ameno-Kal, and his expertise was respected like that of a scholar or priest. His role was not just technical, but ceremonial. Before major journeys, rituals were performed to bless the caravan, and the guide would recite the names of stopping points like an incantation. In the Western Sahara, Berber oral poetry records journeys in verse form. These poems serve not only to entertain, but to encode direction, distances, dangers, and sanctuaries. One line might reference the place where the sand sings before the rocks rise, a metaphorical yet precise reference for those who knew how to interpret it. Even today, some of these traditions persist. Though GPS and satellite phones are now common, experienced camel drivers and herders still use ancestral techniques. In some areas of Mali and Niger, elders can still describe routes their grandparents took across unmarked desert. Modern researchers have begun to document this intangible heritage, recognizing it as both science and culture. Ethnographers work alongside geographers to map these oral systems, translating memory into digital form. Some efforts even use AI to model route logic based on oral patterns. But this knowledge is fragile. As fewer young people take up traditional travel and as climate change reshapes the landscape, there is a risk that the ancient compass will fade. Sand swallows paths and silence takes the place of song. Yet the legacy remains. The Sahara was never a void. It was an archive, and its chapters, written in starlight, its directions sung beneath the moon. To move through it required not only courage, but wisdom, a different kind of map, a map written in the sky and in the soul. Beneath the silence of the Sahara lie cities made not of dreams, but of clay, stone, and trade. Once vibrant with markets, prayers, music, and letters, they now stand still, half buried in sand, half lost to time. These are the ghost cities of the desert, where the wind is the only storyteller and shadows are longer than memory. One of the most haunting is Tadmeka in present-day Mali. Once a key stop on the trans-Saharan trade route, it was known as a city of gold long before Timbuktu rose to fame. Arab chroniclers described its wealth and its cosmopolitanism, a place where blacksmiths worked beside scholars and where Berber merchants rubbed shoulders with Muslim pilgrims. Today, its ruins lie quietly in the desert. Archaeological excavations have uncovered smelting pits, stone walls, and ceramics that trace centuries of occupation. Yet most of the site remains hidden beneath shifting dunes. To the east, in Niger, are the remains of Jado, a fortress-like settlement perched on a rocky plateau. Surrounded by palm groves and salt pans, Jado was once a thriving town, defended by thick walls and supplied by wells. But the encroaching desert, combined with water scarcity and changes in trade, led to its abandonment. Today, its empty towers still rise, silhouetted against the dunes, home only to bats and silence. Further north, in Libya, lie the ruins of Jerma, capital of the ancient Garamantes. For centuries, the Garamantes ruled a powerful kingdom in the Fezzan region, harnessing underground water with sophisticated Foggara irrigation systems. Their cities flourished in what is now one of the driest parts of the Sahara. Roman records called them fierce and independent. Their cities boasted multi-story buildings, cemeteries, and workshops. Jerma's mud brick walls have crumbled with time, but pottery shards, burial sites, and water channels still tell a story of innovation and adaptation. Then there are the half-visible cities, remembered more in oral tradition than stone. Names like Zazura, the White City, linger in Tuareg legend, a city hidden in a green valley guarded by spirits and filled with treasure. While no archaeological evidence confirms its existence, the persistence of its story speaks to something real. The deep-rooted memory of places lost to the sand but not to the imagination. These ghost cities were not isolated. They were nodes in a dense web of commerce, culture, and scholarship. Caravans brought gold from the forests of West Africa, salt from the mines of Tagaza, slaves from the Sahel, and manuscripts from the Maghreb. In these cities, mosques rose, schools taught generations of students, and markets buzzed with languages and goods from across the Islamic world. Why did they fall silent? Multiple reasons: shifting trade routes, climate change, colonial redirection of commerce, and in some cases conquest or disease. As the Atlantic trade grew and maritime routes eclipsed the desert's slow caravans, many Saharan towns were left behind. Water scarcity intensified, sandstorms engulfed streets, and slowly life moved elsewhere. Yet abandonment is not the end. In places like Ouaddain and Chinguetti in Mauritania, people still live among ruins, their lives unfolding between past and present. In Timbuktu, despite modern challenges, Libraries still house manuscripts that link the city to its medieval heyday. Some ghost cities, like Gao, have become modern towns built atop ancient layers. Modern archaeology continues to map these forgotten places. Satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and drone surveys reveal outlines of streets, foundations, and cemeteries long buried. In some cases, explorers stumble upon cities that had disappeared entirely from maps, only remembered in local legend or old travelers' tales. Preserving these ghost cities is urgent. Erosion, looting, and conflict threaten what remains. But beyond bricks and relics, these sites hold something deeper, evidence that the Sahara was once a network of connected, literate, dynamic societies. To walk through Tadmeka, Jado, or Gurma is to feel the presence of lives once lived with purpose, people who built, traded, worshipped, and dreamed. Their cities were not illusions, they were real, and they mattered. The desert is not empty, it is full of ruins, and full of remembrance. And in the silence, the cities still speak. The Sahara has long been painted in extremes, a desolate void, a natural barrier, a place to be crossed, endured, or avoided. But in the 21st century, artists, architects, scientists, and thinkers are beginning to see it not as a dead zone, but as a canvas, a place of possibility, revival, and imagination. Across the continent and beyond, there is a quiet revolution. The Sahara is being reimagined. One of the most visible aspects of this shift is in architecture and urban planning. In countries like Morocco, Algeria, and Mauritania, new sustainable housing projects are drawing inspiration from traditional desert design. Thick mud brick walls, passive cooling systems, wind towers, and domed roofs, long dismissed as archaic, are now recognized as ingenious adaptations to climate. In Gardaya, Algeria, the ancient city built by the Mozabites has become a model for sustainable urbanism. Its radial street plan, shaded arcades, and communal water systems have drawn the attention of global architects. UNESCO named it a World Heritage Site not just for its beauty, but for its relevance. Urbanists are asking, what can ancient Sahara cities teach us about surviving in a warming world? This question is echoed in experimental projects like the Great Green Wall, a Pan-African initiative aiming to halt desertification by planting trees across the Sahel. While not physically within the Sahara itself, the project has sparked a broader discussion about the desert's rehabilitation. What if, instead of retreating from the Sahara, we learn to live with it, work with it, and restore parts of it? In Niger and Mali, local initiatives are reclaiming sand-choked land using ancient methods like stone bunds, zai pits, and intercropping, techniques that trap moisture and restore fertility. These are not innovations in the modern sense, they are resurrections of ancestral knowledge. Art is also reimagining the Sahara. In Dakhla, southern Morocco, a new wave of Saharan contemporary artists is using sculpture, photography, and installation to explore identity, migration, and memory. Their works reject the desert as void trope. Instead, they treat it as archive, stage, and mirror. The Taragalte Festival in Mohamed El Ghizlain, Morocco, brings together musicians, storytellers, and thinkers to celebrate nomadic culture. It is both a revival and a protest, a statement that the desert is not empty, not silent, and not irrelevant. Performances take place under stars, between dunes, reclaiming space for culture in the most elemental of settings. Technology, too, is part of this reimagining. In Tunisia, solar farms stretch across arid plains, turning sun into energy at scales unthinkable a century ago. Engineers are now exploring whether vast portions of the Sahara could one day power entire nations, a reversal of the colonial model where resources were extracted and exported. Here, Energy remains local, regenerative, and grounded in place. Even cartography is changing. Scholars and activists are producing new maps of the Sahara that include not just borders and roads, but oral landscapes, tracing ancestral grazing paths, pilgrimage routes, and sacred sites. These maps reject colonial abstractions and restore the sense of the desert as lived space. Young people from desert communities are joining this reimagining. In online platforms, Tuareg poets share verses in Tamashek. Fulani musicians remix traditional rhythms with hip-hop. Sahrawi activists post oral histories that counter official silence. The Sahara, long seen as isolated, is now globally connected, not just via fiber optic cables, but through a new digital nomadism that reclaims identity. Museums and universities are also participating. Exhibitions on Saharan manuscripts, music, and migration challenge viewers to see the desert as a center, not a periphery. New research initiatives, often led by African scholars, seek to document and preserve intangible heritage, not just artifacts, but practices, languages, and cosmologies. This is not nostalgia, it is strategy. As the world warms and cities grow, the wisdom embedded in Saharan lifeways becomes newly vital. The desert has always demanded adaptation, resilience, and respect. Now, those lessons are being heard. To reimagine the Sahara is to ask not what has been lost, but what might yet be possible. What if we saw the desert not as a void, but as a vessel, capable of holding past, present, and future? What if we remembered that the Sahara was once a sea of water, of trade, of knowledge, and that it can be a sea again, a sea of ideas, a sea of renewal, and like all seas, alive with movement? There was a time when the Sahara pulsed with the rhythm of hooves. Camel caravans stretching for kilometers moved like ships on a sea of sand, guided by stars, sustained by memory, and bound together by trust. For centuries they carried salt, gold, cloth, books, and stories between civilizations. But in the shadow of highways and cargo planes, that age is passing. Now, in scattered corners of the desert, the last caravans still move, not out of necessity, but remembrance. In northern Niger, near the town of Bilma, salt caravans known as the Azalai still operate. Twice a year, Tuareg herders and traders gather their camels and prepare for the journey across the Tenere Desert. Their destination, the salt mines of Bilma, where slabs of salt, some weighing up to 30 kilograms, are carved from ancient deposits and loaded onto camels. The journey takes weeks. The heat is blistering. Water is scarce. But the Azalai persists, not because it is profitable — trucks could move the salt faster — but because it is sacred. The caravan is a ritual, a lineage, a bridge to ancestors. Young men who join the journey for the first time are not merely working, they are being initiated. Similar echoes exist in Mauritania, where camel caravans still traverse the Adrar region, though increasingly as part of cultural festivals or tourism. In some places, routes are walked not to move goods, but to keep memory alive. The desert itself becomes a classroom, a moving archive where elders recite poetry, explain constellations, and describe wells long gone dry. These last caravans are not only about camels and salt, they represent a way of knowing, a mobile civilization attuned to the language of sand and sky. Caravan leaders were once logisticians, diplomats, healers, and astronomers. They knew how to navigate clan politics, read omens in wind patterns, and negotiate between empires without a single map. In oral tradition, caravans are remembered as lifelines. Towns like Agadez, Timbuktu, Tichit, and Gat rose and fell according to caravan traffic. Markets flourished when the camels arrived, bearing copper from the Sahara, textiles from Europe, and manuscripts from the Maghreb. The traders brought news, languages, recipes, and songs. To receive the caravan was to reconnect with the world. But modernity changed everything. Colonial borders fractured routes. Motorized transport made camels obsolete for commerce. Young people sought other livelihoods. Droughts and conflict made the desert riskier. And yet the knowledge survived. In whispered instructions about which dune to follow, in lullabies sung beside night fires, in the muscle memory of men who can still tie a camel load with one loop. In Mali, some communities now reenact caravan journeys for visitors, not as tourist shows, but as cultural reclamation. They remind their children, we were not always poor, not always forgotten. We once led the world's longest, most complex supply chains, without roads, without clocks, without conquest. Researchers are beginning to study these final caravans not as relics but as systems. What can they teach us about resilience, about cooperation across vast, hostile terrain, about low-impact mobility in a warming world? The answers are there, hidden in saddle knots and tea rituals, in the unspoken choreography of a night departure under crescent moonlight. But time is running out. Each year, fewer young people join. Each journey becomes a little harder to organize. The salt blocks grow smaller, the wells drier, and so what was once a pillar of Saharan life becomes a pilgrimage of memory. Still the last caravans move, their bells ring through the silence, their tracks etch ancient paths anew, and their stories, if we listen, tell us that movement is not just about distance, it is about meaning. And in the deep hush of the desert, that meaning lingers, one hoofprint at a time. There is no throne to be found, no palace of gold, no empire with borders still drawn, and yet beneath the sands of the Sahara, an empire endures, not in stone, but in silence, not in conquest, but in connection. It is an empire of knowledge, of movement, of memory. An empire erased from most maps, but not from history. To walk the Sahara today is to move across a graveyard of forgotten grandeur. But the bones of that empire remain. Cities like Tadmeka, Jerma, and Tichit whisper of ancient trade. Rock art in Tassili Nadja speaks of lush pasts and spiritual life. Manuscripts in Timbuktu preserve the thoughts of scholars who once debated law, stars, and metaphysics under oil lamps. It is easy to see the Sahara as void, empty, static, harsh. That was the colonial view, and it still lingers. But what if we saw it instead as a medium? A place through which things moved. People, goods, stories, ideas. For thousands of years, the Sahara was a living web, a network of migration, faith, commerce, and culture. Its empire was not built by emperors, but by nomads, scribes, traders, and musicians. It had no center, yet it reached across continents. We now know that the Sahara has been inhabited and reimagined countless times, first by those who painted giraffes on cave walls, then by those who herded cattle across green plains, then by those who founded cities, memorized stars, forged salt routes, and inked books in Arabic, Songhai, Tamashek. Each generation built on the echoes of the last and left something behind. This story is not just about loss, it is about layers. A civilization does not vanish when its cities are buried. It continues in language, in rituals, in how people greet each other beneath the acacia tree, or how a teapot is poured 3 times with rising sweetness. These details carry more than etiquette, they carry continuity. What has survived the empire of sand? A way of reading the world not through possession, but through relation. Not through permanence, but through resilience. The desert taught patience, interdependence, and humility, values that today, in an unstable climate and fragmented world, feel urgently relevant. Scholars are only beginning to piece together the totality of this Saharan story. But what they find is astonishing. libraries hidden in desert towns, genetic threads that connect Berber, Arab, West African, and Mediterranean peoples, songs whose rhythms mirror camel gaits, proverbs that encode maps, an empire stored in intangible form, held not by bricks but by breath. In many ways, the desert itself is the archive, not the enemy of civilization, but its cradle. It has preserved what rivers might have washed away. It has demanded adaptability and rewarded memory. Even its harshness has been a teacher. And so this story ends not with a conquest or a collapse, but with a question. What else lies beneath? What manuscripts remain unread? What caravan paths remain unmapped? What wells still whisper in the dark? What dreams, once carried on camelback, still echo beneath the dunes? The empire of the Sahara has not vanished. It has sifted, it has settled, and if we listen, truly listen, we might hear it breathing still, in wind, in stars, in the hush between footsteps. The empire beneath the dunes waits not to be rebuilt, but to be remembered.